I won't make it necessarily specific to me, because there's so many great therapists out there. But I will say, I have had a lot of people say that getting therapy is weak, or I felt weak. But I actually think that it's important to look at it as, when you have the knowledge or wisdom enough to be able to know that you need help to get to that next level, there's actually a blessing, because there's some people that have the tools, and that's actually what we believe, is that you have the things that you need. You might just need that extra help or assistance to know what to do with those tools, right? So it's not like I'm just all of a sudden giving you something that you don't already have, but I'm trying to empower you to know what to do with the things that you have. So for a lot of people, I actually see it as that takes knowledge and wisdom, and it's actually a strength to be able to recognize when you need help. And so, especially in certain communities, I know that seeking help can be seen as something that's negative, but I try to encourage people to look at it that way. And, lastly, I'll just end with, especially when it comes to Christians, I'm a Christian myself, so there are Christian therapists. So it doesn't have to be that you feel like because you have faith that you can't come to therapy. There's a way that you can incorporate it. Faith is actually a strength. It can encourage resiliency. And so those are all things that can be used to kind of help you to grow. But I don't want anyone to feel like there's a reason to not seek help, because it actually shows a great strength when you're willing to admit where you are in order to get to where you need to be. So.
It's the Logan Power Show. Inspirational and motivational. It's the Logan Power Show. Informational to help you grow. Logan Power Show.
And now the host, Calvin Logan.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Logan Power Show. It's me, your host, Calvin Logan, and I thank y'all watching this special broadcast here, the Logan Power Show. I know a lot of times people around the world are going through a lot, and they're going through things that are not just affecting them physically, but also mentally. So I got with me a special guest. She's a mental health therapist. She's going to help just explain some of the things that people are going through, and what are some things, some triggers that we just got to be on the up and up to try to help us to get to the next level. I'm privileged and honored to have our very own Mrs. Marika Dillard. How you doing, Mrs. Dillard?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I know that in your line of work, you've seen a lot of different things. You've seen things that have been very alarming, and things that you dealt with. You focused. I remember we were talking on a Clubhouse. You were mentioning about what some of the veterans actually go through, and how even with hearing and them giving their testimonies impacts you as well. In your line of work, just talk about, like, what are some of the things that you deal with on a daily basis in your line of work?
Sure. So specifically with the veteran population, of course, a lot of times people think about PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And unfortunately, because of a lot of the stigma that people have faced, when people hear that diagnosis, they automatically will say things like, does this mean I'm crazy? Or, they're very kind of hesitant because they feel like it's a label. But typically what I explain to people is that actually anyone can experience PTSD. It doesn't have to just be from combat, but it's from any type of trauma. So some people have like a single traumatic event. Some people can have a series of traumatic events. And basically what PTSD is essentially saying is that, hey, I have these symptoms that derived from this traumatic event. So it's not necessarily the person's fault that they have these symptoms, but it's more so a lot of times, depending on the situation, it's how the person is processing essentially what happened to them. And so we're talking about things like even children can have it, but sometimes what happens is, and especially in certain communities, sometimes what happens is we kind of get used to being told, like, just move on or just get over it, those types of things. And so it might not always be recognized what's actually going on until someone gets older. And then they might start to question, why they're feeling this way, or what has happened. And like I've told some people, is it's not necessarily that the person sort of experiences a different trauma when they get older, but sometimes it's the fact that their understanding of what happened when they were children changes. And so now that they understand, it's like they're able to sort of experience it in a different way, which can also kind of bring back some of those symptoms as well. So that's what I see in regards to working with veterans. But in general, of course, you see things like anxiety, depression. With children, a lot of the social media has started to impact what they perceive as mental health. And it has been good in calling attention to mental health, but there's also the factor of just trying to be aware of not self-diagnosing and being mindful that it's still best to see a professional. So that's a few of the things that I see on a daily basis.
Absolutely. I know it's not easy. Uh, in your line of work, just I guess you're in the fight. Is these conversations, is having them, are they healthy? You know, sometimes people say, well, you know, are you a sounding board? Like you're taking in all the positive and the negative, and is it really helpful? Is it something that you're seeing like, hey, these people do need it, or do people need to find of the alternatives? Like, you know, I need to get into a boxing ring to let out my stress. I need to go and exercise. I need to yell in the woods. I mean, something to let some of these triggers stop ailing me and sort of being and I'm becoming just overwhelmed. Are there like do you feel like in your line of work that you're seeing a breakthrough of health, that the people are getting better?
I think one of the biggest things that I had to learn when I first started was to change what progress looked like for myself. So by that, I mean, outside of mental health, you usually think about progress in big terms, like making big jumps immediately, or you usually look at things as like measuring very big increments. But in mental health, a lot of the way progress is looked at can be small steps. And so a lot of times when people come in, if they already have this idea that progress means they're going to completely not have any symptoms or completely just eradicate everything, I usually try to tell them like therapy is a process. This is not something where you just come in one day and it's just going to go away. It does take time, and it is something that you have to work through. But as far as the activities, we used to call them things like coping strategies or coping skills. And so, for instance, if someone is feeling depressed, we might try to encourage them to do things that they feel sort of brings them more joy. Or if someone's anxious, we might try to talk with them about creating a more relaxing environment, whatever that may be for them. A lot of times what happens is that people in general just get busy and they don't necessarily have recreational activities or things that they can do that's not necessarily associated with some type of stress. So that's where you will see some therapists recommending these sort of extracurricular activities, if you will, to kind of relieve people of the everyday stressors or life stressors that they have. As far as actual progress, it very much depends on the individual. So some people come in and let's say they've been feeling depressed and maybe they've been having issues with hygiene. Just being honest, maybe that's their issue. Progress for them might be, hey, I got up this morning and I took a shower and it wasn't a struggle for me. That's progress. But again, looking at it from outside of the mental health world, you would think like, well, I mean, hey, that's something you're supposed to do or something like that. But when it comes to mental health, it's really very much based on the individual and how they want to see progress, and to them, what will signify for them that they're actually getting better.
Right. You know, I didn't know that, like, for instance, like, I don't know all these things. And I know, I didn't know, like, you know, cleanliness is something that's really a trigger for certain people. You know, some people say, you know, I got bodily odors, you know, it could be like, you know, certain scents I got to put on, maybe certain deodorant don't work for me. Or like, for instance, how I take a shower, I may got to do it a little bit differently so I can get to those spots that are, you know, that can create more of an odorless smell if I don't touch those parts of my body. Now I know we was on a you was on a Clubhouse and you mentioned that people who are the therapists, the people that are giving the help, that they are being bogged down in such a way that it affects them to be able to say, hey, am I still able to stay into the fight and be able to do this? Can you explain like your personal experience? Like, has some of the conversations been difficult for you to say like, wow, I need to take a break myself from the situation?
Well, I will say, every day when I do therapy, I do pray every single day because it's one of those things where you really don't know what you're going into. Even if you know the person, you don't know what they're going to say when they come into the session. And so a lot of therapy is really listening, really having to listen before you respond. And so I always say like, Lord, I don't even know what I would say naturally within myself. And so that's why I always say, I do believe that God really gives me the things to say in these moments with some of the things that I've heard. But as far as just, we talk a lot about self-care, and we tell our patients or clients that, and therapists have to practice that too, because there is something now that they've been talking about. Some people call it vicarious trauma, where it's like you get trauma from listening to the other person's trauma. So in a lot of therapists, if they're not careful, they can start to feel burnt out. You see that also in nurses, doctors, like first responders, police officers, anybody that's sort of in those fields where they're helping people that have been through traumatic situations, or maybe they're the first people on the scene. They can actually experience trauma by helping someone else through their trauma. And so it is important that we also, a lot of times when I am telling people in session about, self-care, I'm like, I probably need to do that too. And that's why you have some therapists that actually go to therapy themselves. So it's one of those things where, because we're all still humans, we're all still trying to work things out. And so there are times when even in session, people have to be aware. It's called transference, and countertransference too is another term that people will use. And people have to be aware and make sure that they're not putting their own stuff on the patient. So like if a patient comes in and they start talking about something that happened in their marriage and the same thing happened to you, you have to be mindful that this isn't your marriage, so you can't start giving them advice or start saying things from your point of view. We have to always kind of remain objective. And so all of those are things that we have to be aware of. And what can happen sometimes if you're not is that you do start to feel burnt out. You do kind of start to feel weighed down. And sadly, that is why sometimes people leave those professions, like the helping professions. I mean, if you look at the news, like education and teachers, a lot of these positions have vacancies just because it is a lot that people do. And sometimes the systems aren't structured in a way to where that self-care is provided. So that's something you definitely have to implement.
I think that you're hitting it on the nail on the head. That a lot of times that we have to understand that it's a two-part situation, like a dual role. I gotta know how to get in, get out, get in, get out. But you made something even more of a very extraordinary point. You mentioned I gotta pray to say, Lord, I don't know what I'm about to deal with today, but I pray that you give me the strength, the wisdom, the understanding, knowledge, how to deliver wisdom to people. Because some things I don't know, but I want to make sure that I have a listening ear and be a good listener before I give my information. And then also you mentioned that I don't want to put my personal experience into the situation because it may not be the answer for that person's resolution. Sometimes it may be I have to be able to look outside the box and get all the factual information before I deliver this particular nugget of wisdom to be able to make them understand that, hey, we can get through this. For you, understanding that you, like you said, this profession is getting thin. There's not a lot of people want to get in this profession, and everyone's not saying, hey, I'm want to be there. What made you decide you were called into this role and say like, hey, I want to be a mental health therapist? What made you decide, hey, I want to go this route?
So to be honest, at when I first graduated, I thought I wanted to go to law school. And it just so happened that at the time on LinkedIn, there was this group where you could like ask alumni and stuff. And I was asking them different questions, and someone mentioned social work. And that's actually what I ended up getting my master's in. I have my master's in social work. And so someone ended up mentioning that. And usually when people think about social work, they think about DSS. That's usually the only profession that they think about. In different states, it's called different things, but it's usually social services. Social work sort of has that kind of negative stigma attached to it. But what I found through the profession is that there's so many different ways that you can use that degree. And as far as getting into therapy, like I said, I honestly think it really was more so a calling, because I don't think this is something that you do just to take lightly, because you are imparting into people's lives. And that's why we do try to stay away from giving advice. Like I can talk to you and I can kind of tell you, but, recommendations potentially, but we try to stay away from giving people advice because people do listen, and they'll be like, my therapist told me whatever. And so I try to be very mindful of how I say stuff in sessions to make sure that I'm not necessarily speaking something into a person's life that's going to be ill-advised. So I definitely do think this was a calling. Like I said, it's something that I constantly pray about, as far as being led the right way and knowing what to say, and then also being able to listen when maybe there's something that I need to do as well that I'm telling the person. So that's kind of what led me to it. The practical side of it, just getting more information about what actually can be done with the degree that I received, but then also the spiritual aspect of, like I said, more so praying about it. And I've worked with different ages, so it's really been great to also see the impact that things have like along the timeline. So in working with children, like I said, you kind of get to start, ideally you get to start early, because you recognize, even when working with adults, that a lot of the stuff still goes back to childhood. So when I work with children, I like to see sort of ideally the changes that can be made early, and hopefully break some of that stuff before they even become adults. Not to say that once you're an adult, it can't be fixed or it can't be broken off of the person, not to say that, but I think it is very powerful when parents bring their children to therapy, because they recognize like, hey, this is something that we need to address early on.
And I think as you're hitting it, like I can see that, you have a good listening ear and people do gravitate to you and people do want to be a part of this. And it seemed like this is really your calling and really your platform. Final thought, we have seen, I'm talking about the United States, in the past 3 years, the coping mechanism of being alone, coping mechanism of being secluded, the coping mechanism of not knowing how to fellowship has really taken a huge, I would say a launch, more of like it's spread like a virus across the nation in the past 3 years. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not hitting it wrong. Maybe I'm seeing, I just believe, like, it's me. This is what I've seen. There's some studies. This 2020, things have really impacted when it comes to the workplace, school system. People are comfortable of being in a more secluded spot and not fellowship anymore. Since these past 3 years, have you seen some of that same scenarios where people are more comfortable being by themselves than being with next to somebody else?
I think as far as in the mental health field, how that plays out is that people were alone dealing with their mental health issues. So basically what I'm saying is, like, there's people now that are seeking help or therapy or assistance, and they'll say things like, you'll ask, because one of the things we ask is how long has the person been experiencing these symptoms, and they'll say like since COVID, or they'll say back since 2020. And if you think about it, that's been 3 years. So essentially the person's saying like, I was dealing with this for however long by myself. until it got to a point where I felt like I couldn't deal with it by myself anymore. So in the mental health field, kind of how that has played out is when things kind of shut down in COVID, you had some therapy practices that shut down too, because they weren't prepared to go to teletherapy, like what we're doing things on Zoom or, different platforms. So you had a lot of places that were not necessarily prepared to be able to still service people. So there were people that needed mental health services, but weren't necessarily able to get it at the time. So now some of these people are actually starting to be able to come back into services. And it's difficult because ideally, when you're in a position to where you started therapy, depending on where you are, you want that to be a continual thing. So if you were in therapy in, say, 2019, and then COVID happened, and maybe you were right on the break of like getting to where you needed to be, and then COVID happened and your practice like shut down or something happened, that's kind of in some ways like going backwards. And so that's kind of what we're seeing now, is that there's some people that didn't have access to services for whatever reason. They're getting back into services, which I'm glad they're coming back. But it's kind of making up for that time, or having to make up for that time.
Absolutely. Well, like I said, this is the final question. I know you're busy and you got a huge plate ahead of you. Let's speak to somebody who's going through, someone who basically said like, man, I don't need therapy. Ain't none that. I don't need no help. Help is for the birds. I'm weak if I ask for help. Tell people why they should choose you, or why should they need help in 2023? The floor is yours.
Sure. So I won't make it necessarily specific to me, because there's so many great therapists out there. But I will say, I have had a lot of people say that getting therapy is weak, or I felt weak. But I actually think that it's important to look at it as, when you have the knowledge or wisdom enough to be able to know that you need help to get to that next level, there's actually a blessing. Because there's some people that have the tools, and that's actually what we believe, is that you have the things that you need. You might just need that extra help or assistance to know what to do with those tools, right? So it's not like I'm just all of a sudden giving you something that you don't already have, but I'm trying to empower you to know what to do with the things that you have. So for a lot of people, I actually see it as that takes knowledge and wisdom, and it's actually a strength to be able to recognize when you need help. And so, especially in certain communities, I know that seeking help can be seen as something that's negative, but I try to encourage people to look at it that way. And, lastly, I'll just end with, especially when it comes to Christians, I'm a Christian myself, so there are Christian therapists. So it doesn't have to be that you feel like because you have faith that you can't come to therapy. There's a way that you can incorporate it. Faith is actually a strength. It can encourage resiliency. And so those are all things that can be used to kind of help you to grow. But I don't want anyone to feel like there's a reason to not seek help, because it actually shows a great strength when you're willing to admit where you are in order to get to where you need to be. So.
Absolutely. And for those that are watching, getting help, first, I always say this: go to God for your assistance. God will give you insight, wisdom, strengthen you. And then there's some things you can, help them, like if it's your spiritual leader. And then, like I said, going to a therapist on top of it, if that's what you do need to get yourself through it. It takes work for health. It takes work to get healed. It's not something that's it's supernatural healing. If you got the supernatural healing, then you have to then move forward and say, I'm not going back. So it's going to be a process. So for those that are watching, take this time. Let's put God first, and to God be the glory. It's all the time I got. My name is Calvin, the Logan Power Show, nationwide, worldwide. We love you, and we will see you soon.
It's the Logan Power Show. Inspirational and motivational. It's the Logan Power Show. Informational to help you grow. Logan Power Show.